April 27, 1975. In the humid stillness of Hanoi, Colonel Phan Minh Duy sat alone in his office beneath the flickering light of a single bulb. Outside, the monsoon wind carried the smell of rain and exhaust, the city vibrating quietly with the invisible current of history. The war, after 3 decades, was nearly over. Saigon was collapsing. Reports came hourly, columns of armored vehicles advancing, loyalist forces disintegrating, the final orders of a defeated government dissolving into chaos. Victory was certain, and yet, Duy felt none of the triumph that filled the streets below. He felt only the weight of something vast and irreversible, a shadow that victory itself could not dispel. On his desk lay a file he had not opened in years, classified, stamped with fading red ink. Report 39B, on the long-term consequences of total mobilization. He had written it in 1968, during the blood-soaked months after Tet. It had been his attempt to warn the Central Committee that the war's success, if pursued to its absolute conclusion, might consume the very ideals it was meant to protect. He had written, cautiously, that a revolution built entirely on sacrifice must one day confront what remains when there is no one left to sacrifice. That an army forged in fire might forget how to lay down its weapons. That a people raised on struggle might not know what to do with peace. He had not meant it as dissent, only analysis. But in those years, even analysis had become political. The report had circulated briefly through the intelligence department before vanishing into the bureaucratic fog. No one mentioned it again. Duy had survived, promoted but silently marked. Now, 7 years later, the war was ending exactly as he had predicted, militarily triumphant, morally exhausted. He had served the revolution faithfully since he was 17, through the French, through the Americans, through the endless jungles of the Truong Sun Trail. He had watched friends die, villages burn, entire provinces vanish into mud and smoke. He had believed, then, that such suffering was the price of history, that from it would rise a new and purified nation. But as victory approached, he no longer believed in purification, only in endurance. From the radio across the room came the measured voice of a news announcer. Our forces have surrounded Saigon. Liberation is imminent. The enemy is disorganized and demoralized. The revolution is entering its final stage. Duy turned it off. The word liberation echoed in his head like a question. What would liberation look like when the people had been emptied of joy? When the villages that once fed the army were reduced to ashes, and the young men who had survived could no longer sleep through the night? He thought of the American pilots he had studied years earlier, how their industrial power had once seemed invincible, yet they had lost not from weakness, but from distance. A nation could win every battle and still lose its soul. He feared that lesson applied equally to his own side now. In 1968, after Tet, he had stood in a ruined hospital outside Hue, where the bodies of both civilians and soldiers lay tangled under collapsed concrete. An old woman had sat beside the wreckage, holding the hand of a dead boy no older than 12. She had looked up at him, not with hatred, but with confusion, and asked softly, "Is this liberation too?" He had not answered. He had carried that question with him for 7 years, unable to bury it as easily as the bodies around it. He opened the old report and read his own words with a kind of detached astonishment, as if written by another man. The analysis had been precise, perhaps too precise. He had written, "Victory achieved without moral equilibrium becomes indistinguishable from defeat. The enemy's errors will become our own if we inherit his certainty." He remembered the committee's response. They had called him overly philosophical, insufficiently revolutionary. One official had told him, smiling politely, "Comrade, history has no patience for doubt." That had been the end of it. Now, as history fulfilled its script, Duy realized that doubt might have been the only moral defense left to a man inside an unstoppable machine. The revolution had learned to survive by purging those who questioned its trajectory. Doubt was a form of treason, but silence was its own kind of betrayal. He rose from his chair and crossed to the window. Below, the courtyard of the intelligence compound was alive with movement. Jeeps coming and going, officers shouting orders, clerks running with messages. There was excitement, yes, but also fatigue, the kind that years of ideology could no longer disguise. On the wall behind him hung a portrait of Ho Chi Minh, his eyes serene and distant. Duay bowed his head slightly out of reflex, though the gesture felt hollow now. The old man's dream had been pure once. But dreams, he thought, were like revolutions. They age faster than the men who serve them. In Saigon, the enemy government was disintegrating. In Hanoi, the victors were preparing speeches about destiny. Somewhere between those two cities lay the truth he had tried to write about in 1968, a truth that could not be spoken in slogans. He turned back to the desk and began to write again. Not a report this time. A confession, not for the party, not for history, but for himself. He began. April 1975. The war is ending, and with it ends the illusion that victory will make us whole. Outside, thunder rolled over the Red River Valley. The war's final storm was gathering in the south. Duay knew that within days, Saigon would fall. But in a deeper sense, something else was already collapsing, a moral structure built on the belief that suffering automatically justified itself. He had believed that once. He no longer did. For the first time in 30 years, he felt afraid, not of death, but of peace. It was 1968 when Colonel Duay first understood that numbers could be more dangerous than bullets. He had spent months compiling intelligence on American troop strength, industrial output, and bombing tonnage. The data was staggering. The United States could replace every destroyed aircraft within weeks, rebuild every lost bridge within days, and rotate divisions across the Pacific like a revolving door. In pure arithmetic, the war was unwinnable. Yet somehow, the arithmetic didn't matter. He had learned to calculate without believing. In the headquarters at Bac Giang, Duay presented his findings to the Party Oversight Committee, a windowless room filled with smoke, maps, and certainty. His superior, General Lu Van Chan, listened patiently as Duay explained that the American logistical system was unlike anything in history. They can lose 1,000 men and not blink, Duay had said quietly. Their factories don't sleep. They are fighting with time itself on their side. Chan had smiled the way a teacher might smile at a naive student. Comrade Duay, he replied, you are still thinking in Western terms. You count airplanes and bullets. But history does not count in machines. It counts in will. That word, will, hung in the air like incense, sanctifying every impossible plan. Duay had nodded, as one must, and rewritten the report in the required tone. He learned the ritual of ideological camouflage, bury the truth beneath the proper slogans, dress realism as optimism. Survival required it. In those years, truth was like contraband, handled only in whispers and smuggled between lines. After Tet, the countryside had become an open wound. The American retaliation was merciless. Villages that had risen in support of the revolution were bombed to ash. Duay traveled through the ruins, taking notes for his intelligence briefings. He wrote everything down. The craters that filled with rainwater, the children staring at him with expressions too old for their faces, the forest stripped bare by napalm. But he knew which facts would survive the censor's red pen and which would not. Casualties could be counted, morale could not. He remembered one night in Quang Binh, sitting beside a wounded radio operator named Tuan. The young man's body had been torn apart by shrapnel, yet he smiled weakly when Duay tried to comfort him. It doesn't matter, comrade, Tuan whispered. One life is nothing. The revolution is everything. Hours later, he died still smiling. Duay had recorded his name in the unit logbook, then stopped writing for the rest of the night. He realized he could no longer tell if that kind of devotion was courage or tragedy, or both. By 1970, Dewey's work had shifted from field intelligence to strategic forecasting in Hanoi. The Americans had begun to withdraw, leaving their South Vietnamese allies to hold the line. Officially, this was proof that the revolution was winning. Unofficially, it was proof of something else, exhaustion. Both sides were burning themselves out, sustained only by ideology and habit. Dewey's reports became more cautious, more layered with euphemism. He wrote about necessary reconstruction phases instead of unrecoverable losses. He wrote about temporary tactical setbacks instead of villages erased. Each phrase was a small act of surrender to the language of survival. Sometimes, late at night, he would visit the archives where the confiscated foreign newspapers were kept. Western journalists wrote with a kind of detached astonishment about the resilience of the North. as if endurance itself were a form of genius. They never saw what endurance cost. In 1971, Duay was summoned to the Ministry of Defense for a private meeting. He was told the Central Committee had reviewed his latest assessment. It had contained, among its 100 pages of cautious phrasing, a single line that caught their attention. A victory purchased entirely with the blood of the poor will not remain pure for long. That line had been underlined in red. The deputy minister, a heavy-set man with small eyes, asked him if he understood the implications of his words. "Are you suggesting," he said slowly, "that the revolution exploits the people?" Duay replied carefully, "I am suggesting, comrade, that the people have finite blood." The man stared at him for a long moment, then smiled. "You have a good mind, Colonel. Use it more wisely." After that meeting, Duay was transferred quietly to a lower-profile post, reassessment of American logistical decay, an assignment no one read. He took it as a gift. Obscurity was safer than attention. From that vantage point, he watched history continue its predetermined course, propelled not by reason, but by inertia. Still, he kept writing. Secretly, privately, in notebooks he never signed. He wrote about the invisible toll, the children growing up without laughter, the soldiers who could no longer dream, the quiet corrosion of humanity beneath slogans of unity. He wrote that revolutions, like fires, could warm or consume depending on how long they burned. He never showed those notebooks to anyone. But in 1972, when American bombs returned to Hanoi with a fury unseen before, he read them again by candlelight in his underground shelter. The walls shook with each explosion. The air smelled of dust and burning oil. Above ground, propaganda speakers blared patriotic songs. Underground, Duay wept silently, not for fear of death, but because he realized he no longer knew what liberation meant. He had once believed the war would end with clarity, with the simple moral geometry of victory and defeat. But each year blurred the edges further. The Americans claimed they were defending freedom. His own leaders claimed they were defending justice. Yet both sides had reduced those words to logistics. How many tons of bombs, how many hectares of jungle, how many bodies could sustain an idea before the idea itself rotted? After the Christmas bombings of 1972, Dewey's office received an order from the party secretariat. All morale assessments were to be phrased in constructive revolutionary spirit. Facts could still be reported, but only if they led to optimism. Duay obeyed. He had learned the cost of candor. But privately, he wrote a single sentence in the margin of his final 1972 report, one no one else ever saw. "If we win like this, we will never know what we have lost." He folded the report, sealed it, and sent it through official channels. Then he took a blank sheet of paper and began writing Report 39B on the long-term consequences of total mobilization. It was not a critique. It was a mirror, cold, mathematical, honest. He wrote about how revolutions that sustain themselves too long begin to devour their own rationale, about how ideological certainty replaces empirical truth, how slogans become substitutes for strategy. He wrote that the final stage of struggle is not victory but corruption, when power becomes the only proof of righteousness. He submitted it on April 10, 1968. No one ever spoke of it again. April 29, 1975. The war was ending. Saigon was falling. In the command centers of Hanoi, the radios carried constant updates, voices trembling with excitement, confusion, disbelief. The enemy's defenses had crumbled faster than anyone expected. Helicopters were lifting off from rooftops, evacuating the last Americans and their allies. The revolution's long journey was reaching its destination. Colonel Phan Minh Duy stood at the edge of the communications room, listening without listening. Around him, officers embraced one another, shouted slogans, smoked cigarettes with shaking hands. "We've done it," someone said. "We've liberated the South." The word liberated struck him again like an echo from another life, familiar, but hollow. He nodded, smiled faintly, and walked outside. The courtyard smelled of dust and rain. Overhead, the clouds hung low and heavy, as if even the sky was exhausted. In the distance, through the hum of generators, he could hear the faint, uneven rhythm of celebration, trucks honking, voices singing revolutionary songs. He tried to feel the triumph they felt, but what came instead was a deep, almost physical sadness. He thought of Tuan, the young radio operator who had died smiling in Quang Binh. He thought of the woman in hue who had asked, "Is this liberation too?" He thought of the thousands whose names he had written in reports that no one read, the numbers that had become statistics, the faces that had become abstractions. The war had turned people into arithmetic, and now the arithmetic was ending, but the dead did not subtract themselves from memory. He returned to his office and locked the door. On his desk lay the old report from 1968, Report 39B, its edges yellowed with time. He opened it one last time. The first line read, "A revolution that forgets what it fought for will one day mistake victory for justice." He sat down and began to write again, continuing the confession he had started 2 nights earlier. The pen moved slowly, each word deliberate. He no longer wrote as an officer or a servant of ideology. He wrote as a witness. The Americans are gone. Saigon has fallen. The war is over, and yet the war continues inside us. We have won a world we no longer recognize. We have taught an entire generation to die, but not to live. Our victory is total and therefore incomplete. He paused, listening to the rain begin to fall against the window. In the hallway beyond, someone was reciting a poem into a radio microphone, a voice thick with emotion. It spoke of sacrifice, unity, and the eternal march of history. The familiar cadence of triumph filled the air, comforting, absolute. But Duay felt none of it. For years, he had lived within the machinery of belief, feeding it, oiling it, obeying it. Now that the machine had achieved its purpose, he saw the hollowness inside. There would be new speeches, new medals, new enemies to replace the old ones. The revolution would need to sustain itself by finding perpetual struggle, because struggle had become its identity. Peace would not come easily to a nation built on sacrifice. He looked again at the portrait of Ho Chi Minh on the wall. For a moment, he imagined the old man alive, reading these words. What would he have said? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps he, too, had understood that the price of vision is watching it consumed by reality. He wrote, "We told ourselves that victory would redeem suffering. But suffering does not vanish when the shooting stops. It only changes form. It becomes silence, bureaucracy, history. And history, like ideology, forgets." Duay set down the pen. The confession was not long, but it was honest. He knew it would never be published, never even archived. It would exist only as a private act of reclamation, a small rebellion against the collective certainty that had defined his life. A knock came at the door. It was his aide, a young lieutenant barely 25. His face glowed with pride. "Comrade Colonel," he said breathlessly, "the capital will celebrate tomorrow. The General Secretary himself will speak. You're expected at the square." Duay nodded. "Of course." The lieutenant hesitated. "You don't seem happy." Duay smiled softly. "I am," he said, "just tired." When the young man left, Duay folded the confession and placed it inside the same folder as Report 39B. Then, from his desk drawer, he took a small steel lighter, the kind he had carried since the French War, and set the edge of the paper aflame. The fire spread quickly, curling the pages into black petals. He watched without regret. Some truths, he thought, must be spoken even if no one hears them. But some must also be destroyed, lest they become weapons in another ideology's hands. As the last flame died, he whispered the final line he had written from memory. "Revolutions win wars, but truth alone can win peace." He sat there for a long time, listening to the rain. Outside, the sound of celebration grew louder. In the south, tanks were rolling through the gates of the presidential palace. History was unfolding exactly as it was supposed to. Yet for Duay, the victory felt strangely weightless. He thought of all the years spent believing that suffering led to meaning, that every death was a step toward redemption. But now, with the war over, redemption had not arrived, only silence. He stood and opened the window. The night air was cool, carrying the faint echo of distant gunfire, the last, aimless bursts of a dying war. He looked out over the darkened city and tried to imagine what peace would look like. He could not. In that moment, he understood what his younger self had meant in Report 39B. That truth is not a weapon to win wars, but a mirror to survive them. The party would write its histories, the victors would compose their songs, and the dead would remain unnamed except in official lists. But somewhere beneath all that, the truth would persist, like the faint hum of the earth after a storm, unacknowledged but undeniable. Duy turned off the light and left the office. In the hallway, a janitor was sweeping dust from the tiles, humming softly to himself. Duy nodded to him and walked out into the rain. The streets of Hanoi were slick and shining, reflecting the red flags that lined the lampposts. Fireworks burst faintly in the distance. Children cheered, unaware of the ghosts marching beside them. Colonel Phan Minh Duy walked alone through the wet streets, past the crowds gathering in front of loudspeakers, past the banners proclaiming unity and eternal revolution. He felt no anger, no bitterness, only an immense, quiet understanding. He had lived long enough to see both sides of victory. At the intersection near the old citadel, he stopped and looked up at the sky. The rain was easing, the clouds breaking apart. Somewhere beyond them, he imagined the voices of those who would never see this day. He raised his hand in a small, almost unconscious salute, not to flags or leaders, but to them. Peace, he whispered, though he knew the word had lost its meaning. Then he walked on, disappearing into the dark streets of a city that was finally free, and yet still captive to its own memory. Epilogue. Years later, historians would find fragments of Report 39B in a forgotten file room, its author unmentioned, its warnings unheeded. The phrases were stark, almost prophetic. They spoke of moral exhaustion, of ideological blindness, of the mathematics of belief. Scholars would quote them as evidence that even within the victorious revolution, there had been those who saw too clearly. But by then, Colonel Phan Minh Duy was long gone. His name appeared nowhere in the official record. What remained was the idea that a man could love his country enough to doubt it, could serve a cause yet refuse to be devoured by it. That, perhaps, was his victory.